Tristan Lopez, joined with my partner in crime, the great William Bibiani. Bibbs, how are you?
I am adequate, thank you.
We are back talking about a movie that is actually relatively new. We are talking about the 2020 feature Mank, directed by David Fincher, with the script written by his dad, Jack Fincher. Stars Gary Oldman, Amanda Seyfried, Lily Collins, a lot of other famous people. And it is the story, if you think I'm going to say it's the story of Herman Mankiewicz writing Citizen Kane, you would be kind of wrong. And we can talk about that in a second. The story, kind of how Herman Mankiewicz, played by Gary Oldman, developed writing the script for Orson Welles' Citizen Kane and his relationship with William Randolph Hearst, played by Charles Dance, and Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, played by Amanda Seyfried. Now, we've done a Hearst story before. One of the first episodes was on the HBO TV movie RKO 281 with Liev Schreiber as Orson Welles. Now, that movie was more of a Orson Welles writing Citizen Kane type of thing. And what was it? John Malkovich was Mankiewicz.
Yeah.
If memory serves, Bibbs, we both liked that movie for what it was.
I'm actually a fan of that movie, but it is very much a TV film. It's pretty ambitious for a TV film. It's got a pretty good ensemble cast, but it's a very nuts and bolts. Here's how they made it. Here's how all the pieces came together. If it had been released in theaters, it probably wouldn't have done very well. In the slightly lowered expectations of the made-for-TV environment, it is well above average. And if you like Citizen Kane, even if you call BS on a fair amount of it because it's a little fawning over certain people, you'll appreciate it, and I think you'll appreciate all like the in jokes and references, and you'll appreciate that the people who made it were very clearly in love with that era of Hollywood and wanted to tell this story within it. It's a fun film, whereas I don't think Mank can fairly be called a fun film.
No, and I don't think Mank can necessarily be called a Citizen Kane movie. If you want to crash course more in the Mank Wells issues that they had and that whole who wrote Citizen Kane, and you really want to know about the making of that movie specifically, I kind of give the edge to RKO 281 for being a more conventional, how did this get made type of movie. Mank, for me, the biggest thing I said was that it's a real inside movie. And that's the weird thing. I've been talking to a lot of my colleagues who are also old film people, and we've all said the same thing, which is that we know this movie is made for people like us, but we don't really care for it because it feels so inside. I don't know how a person that doesn't know all these players, all these people, would really come away with an enjoyment of it, because so many of the nitty gritty elements are so specific to that time period. But then at the same time, for those of us that did know, we were just kind of like, yeah, it's fine. What did you think? Am I being too cynical? Is it
No,
2020?
well, it is 2020. No one can pretend it's not. But no, I don't. I actually don't disagree with you here at all. Whereas RKO 281 was trying to capture like sort of a broad swath of everything going on at that period of time, where films like, I don't know, Cradle Will Rock is trying to give you like this big history lesson, even though they made up some of that movie. Um, a film like Mank is trying to, I think, the implication is it's telling you the real truths, man. Yeah, this is what it was really like. Yeah, like the stuff they don't
I
want
can
you to
see I
know.
can see somebody smoking a cigarette right now with like
Yeah.
being like, this is how it really went down.
Yeah, there's something about that is it's a little frustrating because this movie has such a narrow focus that its attempt to show you some sort of reality can't help but come across as false, not the least of which because the film is so hyper stylized. It's shot in black and white, which is, of course, perfectly valid. It's actually very pretty, but it's actually so pretty that it doesn't even evoke the exact cinematography of the time, which adds to this level of pretentiousness like we know better now. And on top of it all, it's so hyper focused just specifically on Herman Mankiewicz that it ends up feeling less like, oh, here's what happened from Herman Mankiewicz's perspective, and more like the dreaded great man narrative, in which it turns out that Herman Mankiewicz was responsible for everything. And I don't just mean Citizen Kane, which, again, this is not about the making of Citizen Kane. This is about the making of the first draft of Citizen Kane, which really doesn't preclude the idea that Orson Welles and other people had a big hand in it. It never actually claims that, so it's very much Herman Mankiewicz did all of Citizen Kane, which is, we'll talk about that in a minute, where that comes from. But it also argues that Herman Mankiewicz is the reason why we're not living in a socialist utopia. And there's something about that, okay, maybe there's, I don't know the whole facts behind that. Maybe there's a nugget of something in there where Herman Mankiewicz had an unexpected ripple effect on history. But the audacity of the film to suggest that Herman Mankiewicz had this unique and distinct and individual influence on the history of American politics, that there's something I find actually kind of laughable about how self-serious it is about such an accusation, which is clearly, even if there is some accuracy to it, is clearly being it clearly has blinders on, which is frustrating.
Yeah, this is a movie that I kept equating to like a company making something that is meant to play on your nostalgia, but not really and trying to make it look so much like that, but on the whole, not really understanding why that nostalgia is there to begin with. It's kind of like when Abercrombie and Fitch or something makes one of those like stylized T-shirts that looks like it's from the 80s, and they use the same stuff, or bringing back new Coke, but not really understanding like the exact recipe. I don't know. There's a metaphor there, but
Though it reminded me a little bit of the movie Saving Mr. Banks, which is, of course, a
yeah.
Disney movie about how Disney was 100% correct to trample all over the rights of the artist who created Mary Poppins and mansplain to her how they fixed her narrative and then rewrite the narrative behind the scenes of Mary Poppins so that she was grateful for what they did instead of what actually happened, which was she put in her will and testament that they couldn't touch Mary Poppins ever again. And then when she died, they immediately ran after the rights so they could do a sequel, and that's exactly what happened. It's incredibly self-serving, but it's not self-serving from that corporation. It seems like it's self-serving from people who feel like a kinship with Herman Mankiewicz, which I suppose I can appreciate.
That reminds me that Saving Mr. Banks is a movie that could fit on this podcast. So future idea maybe.
No!
This episode is made possible thanks to the continued support of our lovely Patreon subscribers. If you'd like another way to support us, recommend us to anyone looking for classic entertainment goodness. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you aren't yet a subscriber, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ticklishbiz for giveaways, early access, and lots more additional bonus content.
But like, Fincher, we all know, is a big auteur, and so the movie's look is probably the closest I've ever seen. And we've seen a lot of these movies, as Bibbs mentioned, a couple that have tried to evoke the feeling of being from that time period. I think for a lot of people, the most accessible and the closest one up until now was something like Hail Caesar. And this movie goes one step beyond. Fincher tried to, what did they say? He altered the film stock so that it looked like it had that 1940s grain to it. They did the lighting and all of this stuff, the opening credits, which I knew right off the bat I was probably going to nitpick a lot of this, because those opening credits, yes, they look like something from a 1940s movie, but they move so quickly because they have to get to the movie that you can't really read them. So it's just there as because it was that time period.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so watching the narrative, I kept saying, I think it's brilliant that Fincher made a movie that fits like it would belong in 1940. But the problem that I have is it's less Citizen Kane and more The Razor's Edge. And if you've seen any movie from the 1940s, I mean, in the sense that it is quote unquote an important picture of that era. They did a lot of these in the 1940s where it usually had a really lengthy runtime. It had every big star in the studio stable to tell the story of a really important person. Alexander's Ragtime Band, The Life of
Oh
Emile
God.
Zola.
How dare you bring up Alexander's Ragtime Band, the story of how white people invented jazz.
Right, and
Oh.
that's exactly what I got the feeling watching Mank every time, is that it's not a movie that I would necessarily enjoy from the 1940s, but it was a movie that showed what was important, or what people in the 1940s thought was important.
Well, on some level, yes, this is the kind of thing they might have done, but it's not the way they would have done it. And
Yeah.
ultimately, a lot of David Fincher's techniques are much more in keeping with almost a German expressionist mentality. He uses overlapping images and montages, the way that you might find in Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. You wouldn't see that in The Great Ziegfeld. You wouldn't see that in I don't know, the Marie Curie story, or is that what it was called? I'm trying to remember. But
It
like,
was, yeah, something like that, yeah.
yeah, with Greer Garson and yeah, that's the thing. It doesn't feel like that at all, and so ultimately, it doesn't feel like a sincere attempt to recreate something. Like a sincere attempt to recreate something for me is something like Martin Scorsese's The Aviator, which never
Yeah.
pretended it wasn't a modern film, but it did try to evoke old-fashioned sensibilities, not through incredibly distracting, like almost too painterly imagery, but just by adjusting the color timing so that the color timing of the film would reflect whichever color process was available to filmmakers at the time. So that for me felt like it was bridging the gap pretty effectively. And here it's like they're saying, look, we're old in no way except that we're black and white. Like in everything else, this is much more modern. This is much more contemporary. And if it is indeed a throwback, it's a throwback to stuff that wasn't being made in this era, which again isn't necessarily a bad look, but it comes across as a little insincere.
Well, the Aviator is a great example because the Aviator is a similar story about a very important man, but it does things in a way that you always feel it has a trajectory. And I think that was my biggest issue with Mank, is I kept telling people this would have been great as a miniseries, maybe like 6 episodes, and really get into the nitty gritty of the things that Fincher and the script seem to be interested in, which isn't necessarily about Citizen Kane. It's about all these other things. And it makes the film feel rather plotless at times, because you have Mankiewicz, we're introduced to him kind of shored up in this cabin trying to write the script, meanwhile dealing with his drinking problem and trying to stay sober. But then most of the movie is told in interrelated flashbacks, also presented as script pages, where he goes back to the 1930s and meets William Randolph Hearst and Marion Davies, and has to deal with his wife, and also this overarching thing about the studio and being involved in the politics of Los Angeles, and Upton Sinclair trying to run for government. I forget, what is he running for, Congress or
I think he
something?
was running for governor.
Governor.
And it's interesting you bring up the flashback structure, because as I was watching this, and again, they're talking in the movie about how they're using a flashback structure to structure Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane has a flashback structure from a variety of different perspectives so that you can get as close to a complete picture of someone as possible. And only from the outside, we never hear Kane's perspective, but that's all we ever get, isn't it really? Mank, like by calling attention to the flashback structure, is basically just saying, and we're like Citizen Kane, right? Except you're not. You're only telling it from Mankiewicz's, frankly, very self-centered perspective. And as a result, you're not getting a complete story. It doesn't actually feel like it equates. This feels like an incredibly intimate kind of portrayal. But again, it also feels like it's trying to be here for posterity, because it has all these big speeches, and it's about politics, and it's about the state of the whole industry, and it's about the way that the Depression hit the industry. And it ended up feeling like a history lesson that I cannot accept.
When it feels like a history lesson that you really need to know a lot of the players and what was going on, because this is not a movie you can dive into necessarily and know all of the stuff that's important. I appreciated Fincher including some of the smaller players, smaller by comparison to the average person, not necessarily small to people like you and I who know, but people like Thalberg. Thalberg never gets included in MGM stories. It's always Louis B. And here you really get to see how Thalberg was presented as being on the same level as Mayer. The issue is that if you don't really know Thalberg's trajectory, the movie's not going to help you out there. So there's this moment where Thalberg tells Mank it's that great big I don't have enough time moment, and then they just leave it there, and you don't really know. And if you don't know that Thalberg died young, you're not really going to get that, especially because the actor playing him looks relatively healthy, and Thalberg was known as more of a kind of sickly personage, especially towards the end of his life. But on top of that, there's all these other elements at play that really benefit you knowing a lot of this stuff already. And that's why I keep saying I don't really know who this movie's made for.
I'm 100% with you here, and I think that's a dangerous thing to do when you're telling a story about history, because the people who actually know all the details, we're out there, but we're a small part of the audience. We really are. The majority of people are going to have a passing familiarity with some of these names at best. Maybe they'll recognize some of the very quick cameos. There's a big scene at MGM where it's full of various people from all walks of life, people from all different fields, the actors, the directors, etc. And there's like a couple of famous people who are very clear. That's clearly Shirley Temple. That's clearly like, and she has one line, but I think anyone in the audience is going to go, "Oh, I know that persona. I get the gist of this. I know Hollywood." But you're
I think
right.
there's like a dog in that scene too, and you're like, oh yeah, Rin Tin Tin was a dog. I don't know if that's the same dog,
Right?
but get it.
Exactly. So all of these things are designed to be appreciated. In fact, a lot of my favorite things in the movie are the incidental details, like when Thalberg is yelling at his receptionist because she let the Marx Brothers hang out in his office and they cooked hot dogs in his fireplace. That's funny. I liked that bit. But again, if you don't really know Hollywood and you're only hazily familiar with the brothers Marx, you're not really going to appreciate all that jokes. So all you've really got here is the story of a raging alcoholic who said many witty things and had a lot of firm beliefs, and had a gambling problem, who accidentally like ruined the political trajectory of California and wrote a movie which, again, hopefully, Citizen Kane turned out good, because again, it's not really giving you the context. Now, I also appreciate that if this had been really didactic and been extremely explained everything, that it would have been a little tedious. It would have felt like a history lesson. It would have felt like a Lifetime movie. Maybe that would have stunk. And so it has to be a certain level of understanding that if you're seeing a movie about Herman Mankiewicz, you probably have some general idea of why you're here.
You bring up things that you liked, and I there was definitely elements of this that I enjoyed, and the main person that I walked away with wishing I had a movie about them was Amanda
This
Seyfried
is her
as Marion
movie.
Davies. This is her movie. I just want a Marion biopic at this point because I feel like we've talked twice now about Marion Davies in Hollywood. And I often feel like she is always perceived as the Yoko of old Hollywood. You know, she's the one that turned Hearst into the person that he is. And, you know, in RKO 281, it was Melanie Griffith, and she gave a rather sensitive performance, but that was not her movie. And she was just there as this loud, blousy type of character. Another movie that we haven't talked about that would be good to talk about at some point, The Cat's Meow, which is a very different genre of film, but Kirsten Dunst playing Marion Davies as somebody who is this very flighty, daffy girl who oh no love triangle type of thing. That tends to be the two halves of Marion in entertainment. And this is the first film to really give her due as a person. Now, I'm good friends with Marion Davies' biographer. Shout out to Laura Fowler, who helped me on an article that we're doing on accuracy of Mank. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like there was a lot of liberties taken with her character, even though they are more positive than other films. But what I appreciated about Seyfried, not only does she look a lot like Marion Davies, I mean, it's probably as good a replica facially as we'll ever get, but that she captures that character without making it feel like an imitation. There's an accent, but it's not a
Well, I
phony
actually think that this
accent.
is I feel like in the other movies in which we've seen Marion Davis, and I think I feel like Cat's Meow tried a little, but that movie had its own perspective. And I know that RKO 281, at the least at the end, wanted to give Marion Davies some moments to show that she was a more rich human being than she had been given credit for, even in Citizen Kane. Um, but it feels like, I will say this for Mank, it has sympathy for her, because I think they're arguing that Herman Mankiewicz had sympathy for her, that they were friends. He was not friends with Hearst. He liked her because she was, according to the film, uh, kind,
A
honest, but
normal person,
a relative
unaffected.
a relatively normal person, but still someone who is in the industry and still someone who cared about her career and someone who makes some hard decisions because of that. And I can appreciate that. I can appreciate the complexity of the character as portrayed in Mank, even while other characters are portrayed as incredibly superficial. I think Louis B. Mayer, played by Arliss Howard, he's a fun character to watch, but we don't really get any depth out of him. I think Hearst, played by Charles Dance, comes across as quite the supervillain, doesn't he? And that's not even an entirely inaccurate depiction, but I think even Mankiewicz had more sympathy for that when he portrayed him in Citizen Kane as a fallen human being. So it's something that's really frustrating, where again the movie picks the characters, or the real life historical figures rather, that it likes and wants to celebrate, and to hell with everyone else.
There's a very black and white, no pun intended, perspective to this movie, and we can talk about that with a character that is in this movie that I like the performance, hated the character, and hated where the character went, and we can bring that up in a second. But Amanda Seyfried, I think, does really well in terms of giving us a woman who understands that she has everything she wants, but yet feels like she can't complain about it, or at least can't be a sympathetic personage because she has everything. And at the same time, she can be a little vain. She leaves MGM to go to Warner Brothers, and Mankiewicz implores her to go back and tell Louis B to pull this film about that's against Sinclair, that's obviously been mocked up. And she says, "Well, I can't. I've already made
That's
my
the best scene in
exit."
the movie. For me, that's the best scene in the
Which,
movie. That was a good bit.
it's a great moment, according to my friend Laura Fowler. Would have never happened.
Yes, agreed.
But she also says that her Mankiewicz and Marion Davies did not have a friendship. They did not know each other very well, aside from the fact that Charles Lederer, who was a screenwriter, who was Marion Davies' nephew, did know Mankiewicz. And she's like, they might have had a casual friendship in passing, but they were not bosom buddies. I think the issue that I had mostly is that at the end of the day, the movie does really say that, she is Susan Alexander in Citizen Kane. So it kind of wants to give you that perspective, but then take it away. Other characters, you're totally right. I think that in some cases they don't go hard enough on some of them. Louis B is a great example. There's so much written about Louis B. Mayer as being a horrible person. And I feel like a lot of movies really have a problem portraying that. Last year, Judy did a Louis B. movie impersonation that was pretty much all evil.
Extremely
There's
evil.
like nothing there. Extremely
wow.
evil. This kind of makes him a bit sillier, a little bit. Like, he's got that moment where he's giving the speech that you mentioned to everybody to take a pay cut. And he goes back into the wings and says, "How did I do?" But, like, pretending he's been crying. So it really doesn't really know what to do with him in terms of, is he a villain? Is he?
He feels like an Aaron Sorkin character who got lost. He got lost on the way to a different movie. That's my thing.
Yes, and Charles Dance, I think, is good. I think he's the best, though, in those moments opposite Seyfried and not Gary Oldman. Watching how Marion Davies and Hearst interacted with each other, that they did have this loving relationship, but when she talks out of turn, she knows that she's got to step back and act like she doesn't know what she's talking about. Those are really interesting. But then that's not what the movie is about. It's really about Mankiewicz having that big moment at the end where he's kind of laying out how he knows who all of these people are and embarrassing them, but making a fool out of himself. So there's a lot of this inside language, but it's all funneled through Mankiewicz. And I mean, this is a good Gary Oldman performance, But if you've seen Gary Oldman give this, I feel like I've seen him give this performance several times.
He's playing like a bitter, cynical person with a streak of nobility. This is exactly the kind of performance that he won an Oscar for Darkest Hour. And frankly, you know, I know that Gary Oldman, you know, there's things about his past that have made a lot of people not very interested in seeing movies from him. And I totally get it. I don't know the whole story, but I totally get it. Even with that, this is not great Gary Oldman. This is Gary Oldman who is literally just being asked to Gary Oldman his way through this. This doesn't stretch his muscles. This doesn't challenge him in a meaningful way. I'm sure he gave it his all, but frankly, he does not pop off the screen the way that he has before, or even he's even disappeared into roles in which he has had to play very meek, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. Yeah, this is kind of just him being asked to anchor the film, and he's so just generically reliable in it, and he's playing the alcoholism and gambling so broad that frankly all he can really do is give a few supporting characters opportunities to shine opposite him, which I guess is good, but it's not really what I don't think it's what the movie demands.
No, I mean, you get a little bit into his relationship with his wife, who has obviously had to put up with a lot of flack from him, played by Tuppence Middleton, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way because she is significantly younger than he is, and she looks significantly younger. That's a problem that Hail Caesar also had. Only it didn't feel as skeevy in this as it did in Hail Caesar with Josh Brolin and Allison Pill being married. But you don't really get a lot of their relationship other than, you know, the fact that she's seen this before. She's gone through this with him numerous times. There's obviously a history there, but because he's playing these drunk scenes so broadly, it's hard to really see it for what it is, which a lot of people, you know, have said it was a very destructive union.
She gets to play one of the most thankless roles in all of drama, the long-suffering wife. And she is given no opportunity to break out of that or give him a great speech, really. She just has to be there, and it's dull. And which brings me, by the way...
answer the phone. Don't forget, every good long-suffering wife has a good phone call.
That's true. But also, which brings me to Lily Collins. Lily Collins plays Rita Alexander, who is Mankiewicz's typist, basically. And she is also the exact same character that we saw in Darkest Hour. The young woman who comes into the story, witnesses it from the outside, and also she has a husband in the war, and she's going to have a big phone call about what happened to him. And again, I know that both of these films are based on a true story. No one noticed that that's weird and distracting, that it's the exact same subplot. It's the exact same subplot.
I'm going to bring up, Lily Collins I think she's an actress that's getting better and better in everything she does.
I like her a lot.
I like her a lot. This is the character I hated. I hated her so much. She does a great Celia Johnson impression. If you ever wanted to redo Brief Encounter or like any type of 1940s British feature, she knows exactly how to sell that type of character. It felt the most lived in imitation of that time period. I would love to know what movie she watched, because I felt like she really got what Jack Fincher wrote this character to be, which is kind of like that staunch, stiff upper lip British woman that you saw in a lot of those 1940s British films, like The Holly and the Ivy and stuff like that. So I applaud her for doing her homework. Okay, the problem is the character's awful, because not only is she the one that's supposed to be nursemaid and typist, she's the one that's always kind of looking at Mank side eye, like, he's drinking, and she's like, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. But the movie also doesn't seem to it writes her as a caricature, but it doesn't seem to know that it's done that. So, like, the fact that her last name is Alexander, there's never any discussion about whether Mank just kind of co-opted that for the character of
That's
Susan
really
Alexander.
Weird. That's a weird, considering all the other parallels that they're eager, indeed, desperate to draw. You know, they even say that, like, they even posit that Herman Mankiewicz's whole white parasol speech was actually his own story that he told, and like all of these things.
Exactly.
And we're not going to draw that parallel again. They don't know what to do with that character. She is literally there to be someone for Herman Mankiewicz to talk to while we
Yeah.
have our framing device. But here's the thing: we have another character already, and she knows him, and they have a more like meaningful relationship. Oh my god, the scene in which Lily Collins goes up to the other woman who's helping take care of Mankiewicz, I forget the character's name, and she's just like, he's an alcoholic and he's a bad person. And she's like, actually, he's the greatest human being who ever lived. He's the greatest human being who ever lived. He rescued all of these people from World War II, and that's why it's 100% okay that he's an alcoholic who treats people badly. So you should be ashamed of yourself. And Lily Collins goes, you're right. I am ashamed of myself. He is the greatest human being who ever walked the earth. I apologize. I'm going to be on his side entirely from here on out. Here's your booze, Mank.
And that's the issue is that, you can, as we've seen in the 20th century, you can be a horrible person and do good things. So I think that that's
That's what Citizen Kane is about.
right. Exactly. And the movie does not get that at all. But I think what really just kind of made me want to tear my hair out is that at the end, Lily Collins' character is getting letters from her husband, who's a soldier in the war. And I kept waiting for that Betty Spaghetti League of Their Own moment where we find out that the guy's obviously dead. And she
Best
gets a
version
letter.
of that story.
She gets a letter that says he's been lost at sea, or his ship went down or something. And Mankiewicz is like, well, obviously this guy's dead. Okay, like he's dead, dead, dead. And she's like, no, until there's a body dragged out and presented to me, he is not dead. And at the end of the movie, she gets the letter in the mail that says he's been found, and obviously he's not dead. And I get what the movie was going for.
What was the movie going for? Because I'm dead serious, because I'm watching this and I'm like, this is a corny propaganda movie plot point right out of Their Finest. Which is another great movie, which we should totally do someday. But
Yes.
again, it's corny, it's ham-fisted, it's this mega happy Wayne's World ending, and it's in this movie that's supposed to be dark and hard hitting. Is it supposed to make us question the reality of the film and think to ourselves, oh, this movie you've just shown us is utter crap? Is that what it's for?
So was the thing where I said I felt like it's a quote unquote very important picture, is that on the one hand it wants to be this true story, presumably, of Mank, but on the other it also wants to be a movie, and Fincher's talked about this, that would fit right in the 1940s, as if it belonged there. And so the only thing I could come up with conceivably is that at the end of all these very important pictures, the girl, obviously there's a happy ending, there has to be something positive. And the only reason I could think that this is included is that it is calling back to this is a movie that would fit in the 1940s, but it's not
And it's
consistent.
not. It's not. If this movie was put out in the 1940s, people wouldn't know what to do with this danged thing, and not in a good Citizen Kane way. There'd probably be some people who were just like, "Wow, what a strikingly composed motion picture." But it's not what narrative storytelling was like at the time, and
Yeah,
you
it
don't have to
cherry
do that. But
picks.
if he specifically says his intention was to make it feel like an actual 1940s film, he failed. He
It's not
failed at that.
consistent. That's the thing. Yeah, you can't pick and choose when you want to do that. I'm curious. The Mankiewicz elements of creating Citizen Kane and his story. Do you feel it would have been different in RKO 281? It's all about Mankiewicz and Orson Welles butting heads. They have so many scenes where they're like yelling at each other and talking about credit. Orson Welles in this movie is a relatively minor figure who pops up once or twice, mostly through the phone. Do you think that giving him a bigger presence might have helped something, at least giving us a foil?
I think a foil would have really, really helped Mankiewicz. The question, of course, is how much of a presence is warranted. Now, again, this isn't about the making of Citizen Kane. If it was, Orson Welles would have to be around more. This isn't even a film about the writing of Citizen Kane, because Mankiewicz only gets through the first draft. So the movie argues, and to the best of my knowledge, this is more or less accurate, that Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz talked about the script, and Mankiewicz went off to write the first draft. The first draft was huge and unwieldy, and then they rewrote the hell out of it. That's the stuff that's not in here. This is exclusively about the first draft. But here's the thing that's infuriating to me. It's the first draft, but the only stuff we see and talk about in Citizen Kane is stuff that made it into the film. Now, again, this right here is actually very much inspired by a frankly largely discredited article, or I think it's even a book that Pauline Kael published, sort of relitigating the authorship of Citizen Kane, which for many, many years was considered very much an auteur theory kind of film. It was Orson Welles from top to bottom. He gets all the credit. Everyone's genius was filtered through him. Um, Auteur theory is mostly BS, but certainly was applied to Orson Welles throughout a lot of his career. So she wrote this very dense piece about how Herman Mankiewicz was responsible for everything, and Orson Welles basically just slapped his name on it. Apparently, that's not true. There is a lot of documented evidence that Orson Welles rewrote a lot of Citizen Kane, and regardless of that, he did direct it. And we've all seen good scripts turn into bad movies, and vice versa. So removing Orson Welles entirely from the Citizen Kane equation is, again, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty over the authorship of the script, we can have that conversation. But to say that he wasn't involved is a bit preposterous. So I think it would have been stronger. Perhaps, in fact, here's the framing device if I were writing it, and this is a film criticism trap, and I'm not marking the movie down for this, but if we're doing the intellectual exercise, how would I have done this? I would have had it be Herman Mankiewicz delivers the first draft of Citizen Kane, and then the rest of the movie's flashback structure is based on Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz arguing about it, and we see why Herman Mankiewicz is so passionate about what he has written. And then you could even argue that, Orson Welles changing things is somehow undermining Mankiewicz's vision, and you could have a bittersweet ending about that, where the movie turned out good. This is the ending I wish Saving Mr. Banks had, where everyone likes the movie, but in the end, the author's rights were trampled. You can have both. Like, P.L. Travers was mad, but everyone else liked it. Both things are true.
When I think it becomes confusing, especially to people who have heard the story about Mankiewicz not being the real author, because at the end of this movie, it culminates with the Oscars and the script winning and Mankiewicz getting the Oscar. And I know that a lot of people that I have talked to that do not know the story, or don't know the nitty gritty, have said, well, Mankiewicz actually got an Oscar for this, like, he didn't write it, what does this mean? And that's where I always kind of say, like, RKO 281 delves into that a bit more, but it does lead to a lot of confusion. It's why I say that this movie feels very inside, because you're not really going to know all of that stuff if you've only gone off of the basics of Citizen Kane. On top of that, for me, maybe watching this in 2020, so quickly after the election, the Sinclair stuff, I was really not in the mood for, mostly because Sinclair is presented as this socialist type of, he's gonna, according to Hearst and Louis B, is gonna bring us into this whole dirty commie landscape, and they talk a little bit about the what would eventually be HUAC, and we all know how that went in a couple of years. But what we see that could have been really interesting is how the studios, particularly MGM, really got involved in creating the smear campaign, right down to hiring actors to go on radio and create these films.
And again, these were actors who were largely out of work. It was the Great Depression, so moral compulsion aside, they needed to work, and so they were very eager and desperate to do so. The whole subplot of Hollywood getting into politics and using Hollywood subterfuge and Hollywood storytelling dynamics in order to convince people of falsehoods is actually really on the nose. You're right. It actually is a little frustrating and hard to deal with right now, that especially even in the 30s it was a problem, but nowadays, where we're constantly inundated with media on our phones or on our computers, there was a real danger of being manipulated, not just by information, but by specifically how it is presented and by whom. And I feel like that's enough material for a whole different film, and I wish I would have seen that film, because ultimately it plays out like, oh, Upton Sinclair, he's got a lot of idealists on his side, and he's so pure and wonderful. He's literally played by Bill Nye the Science Guy. And
Is that true? Because I thought I was hallucinating.
it's my understanding that it was Bill Nye the Science Guy. And if not, boy, did they get someone who looks like Bill Nye the Science Guy. But in any case, they have to. Yeah, it is. He's on IMDb. It's confirmed.
Fun fact: I did not know until this November 30th of 2020.
There you go. But again, they have to find a way to stop this idealist from, getting, enacting, hugely radical policies. Like, hey, what if people like had things that they needed and they got paid enough? Like, what if? And everyone's like, oh, we can't have that. But the thing is that they feel kind of helpless to stop them until Herman Mankiewicz, of all people, says, "You're telling me that you can like convince everybody that King Kong is 30 feet tall," in a line that feels very much ripped off from the stuntman. You're telling me you convince like King Kong is 30 feet tall, but you can't convince the world that Upton Sinclair is a jerk who's not going to help them. And everyone's like, "You're right. We do run a movie studio." Thank you, Herman Mankiewicz. Thank you for introducing the idea of propaganda into the world. It's like in Step Up Revolution, which I'm so glad I get to reference that today. There's a scene in Step Up Revolution where all of these dancers who are, they're impoverished and they're trying to make these YouTube videos in order to make money and save their community. It turns out their community is going to be gentrified by a big hotel tycoon who, if his hair was red, would be clearly modeled exactly after Trump. And finally, one of them says, "It's enough with this performance art. It's time for protest art." And everyone's like, yes, we should invent protest art. We will be the first ones to do this radical new idea. And again, the movie gives Herman Mankiewicz all the credit for convincing a whole bunch of like producers and filmmakers who have a vested interest in changing a narrative with using their ability to change narratives to change narratives. And I'm like, that seems like a bit of an overstatement. That surely can't be all on him, right?
Don't forget, it all culminates with his friend, whose name I don't remember, who I don't even know if this was a real person.
I looked it up. I can't find his name anywhere.
Yeah, who says he feels horrible that he created these videos or these newsreels for Hearst that were not true. He feels so horrible that he kills himself. And that, again, I feel like Fincher watched a crap ton of very important pictures because, again, that is also a trope that pops up in a lot of these biopics, these faux biopics of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, is that there's somebody there that galvanizes the hero to change because of their death. It's that Yankee Doodle Dandy type
that's
of
storytelling structure 101. I think Save the Cat calls it the whiff of death, where like something bad, something with serious consequences, often a death or a real injury, if it's not that kind of movie, some serious kind of threat to livelihood or whatever, comes along towards the end and reminds you that there are real stakes to this. This actually does matter in some way, but it comes across as really corny and forced, much like the Lilly Collins subplot. And I think it's interesting, and maybe this is me reading a lot into it, but again, we're watching a movie about how the people who make movies infuse those movies with their real life experiences. David Fincher is telling a story about that. David Fincher includes in his narrative a story of someone who, in their first directorial feature, sold out to Hollywood, did exactly what the studio wanted them to make, and it ended up going not his way, and he hated it. And a part of me is just like, did we need the Alien 3 story in this movie, David? Because that's what it plays like. It feels like you're a little close to this one. And I feel like that's the connective tissue here. And it doesn't, again, this whole movie is like trying to be serious. And again, if it's not trying to be serious, if it's trying to be over the top, then it's too understated a lot of the time. And if it is trying to be understated, then it's too over the top a lot of the time. And trying to find this sort of middle ground isn't working for the film because you're always blindsided by a different approach.
You get to have a Step Up Revolution shout out. I get to have my Gable and Lombard shout out.
Yay!
It's the issue I have with Gable and Lombard, and a lot of biopics, especially modern ones, do this in a way that I don't like, which is their life inspired their art and their art inspired their life. I think we talked about this, and I gave a Gable and Lombard shout out when we talked about Liz and Dick, which was very similar. Only in this case, we're saying that everything involved in Citizen Kane was part of Mankiewicz's life. And I don't necessarily know. I mean, I get that that's compelling from an entertainment standpoint, but what does that really say when that's biopic 101?
Yeah, I just there's something about it that seems too convenient, and that's the problem with a great man narrative. Again, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but the great man narrative is a trap that historians warn us against in school. If you ever had a history class in college and you had to do a paper on an individual, they will often tell you if you end up focusing on them too much, it's just like, they weren't the only human being in history. They were part of a rich tapestry, and maybe they did some things, but they did things with other people around. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about them. When a movie goes out of its way to tell you how amazing one human being is, not how impactful, but how amazing, because there's a lot of movies about people who did a lot of things, but also show that in real life they were jerks. Citizen Kane is one of those. It's a fictional biopic, but that's still the structure that it has. Uh, when you don't show that, and when you show that even Mankiewicz's flaws, like his gambling problem or his alcoholism, are in some way directly connected to his personal greatness, and how unappreciated he is, and how he is so directly responsible for Citizen Kane, and if he had only not been so brilliant, maybe Upton Sinclair would have been governor of California. And again, it's like a used car salesman telling you a junker has only 100 miles on it. Like, again, the car might be fine. The car might even have some great stories, but don't tell me it's only got 100 miles on it. I don't believe you. You've pushed me too far, and it starts to feel less like we have one perspective where we're showing Herman Mankiewicz's perspective, and it starts to feel more like you're blowing smoke up my butt.
Do we think that this is going to have a big showing? Obviously, 2020 is going to be a really weird Oscar ceremony, but do we think that that might be in Mank's favor?
I mean, look, the competition is a little smaller than usual this year. There's still some major films that are being released, and they have increased the deadline for films to come out. So I try not to get too invested in like Oscar predictions, because I think too often those predictions end up sculpting the narrative rather than reflecting it. Uh, but again, it's got a couple of things in its favor. It's a movie about how great Hollywood is, and Hollywood loves that. Look at something like Argo, which is all about how Hollywood rescued all of these Hollywood rescued all of these hostages. Look at The Artist, which is all about how amazing Hollywood is. They like to pat themselves on the back, and hey, who doesn't, right? I mean, they can only be so judgmental about it. But I think it's got that in its favor. I think it's a big, flashy movie from an auteur who's never won a Best Director Oscar. And again, I think I personally, the only thing about this movie that I think I would nominate it for is Best Supporting Actress Amanda Seyfried. Like, that's it. That's the only human being I would go, definitely worth singling out. Absolutely brought their A game to this, their best work, and they totally deserve it. Maybe not a win. I don't know who wants to be nominated, but they totally would earn a nomination for me.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't know. This is a really weird Oscar year, but I think that this movie, there's not a whole lot of big buzz. I mean, people that I've heard talk about it, most people like it. I don't hear a lot of effusive, overly hyped praise for this film. And I think that in the cycle that we're in right now, we haven't really heard about a lot of films, but there's definitely ones that have had staying power, things that we're still hearing about. And I'm not really hearing a lot of people say they either love this or necessarily hate it. I don't hear a lot of people saying this is the worst thing they've ever seen, but I think it might end up falling into that gray area of movies that people were just like, oh yeah.
Well, again,
that
it's
came
important to
out.
remember that the Academy Awards, partly it's a popularity contest, but also it's not just popularity in terms of what people like the most. It's what the most people kind of liked. And that's why we tend to get a lot of movies that get a lot of Oscar nominations and buzz and maybe even a few wins. It's not because they're the films everyone is most passionate about, they're the films that people can agree on. And that's why we get films like, which are otherwise, there's some good stuff in them, but when was the last time you heard someone talk about, I don't know, The Imitation Game or Still Alice, outside of the fact that they won Academy Awards? I'm not denying any of them their awards, but they didn't have that staying power. And I think a film like Mank might benefit from just being a movie that makes Hollywood feel kind of important. um, and again, it's from people with big pedigrees. They love an ingenue. They love in particular young female actors to win at the Academy Awards. That happens all the time. So Amanda Seyfried might get a boost there. Again, that's me just sort of observing trends. That might be a huge coincidence. But yeah, I don't know. I think if this movie succeeds at the Oscars, I think it's going to be because everyone kind of likes it, not because anyone loves it.
It's not Citizen Kane. I don't think we'll be talking about this in 20 years, let alone 10. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this movie's legs develop if they do. Final thoughts, Bibbs. What are your final takeaways about Mank?
Mank feels very. Again, I appreciate a movie about insider Hollywood. That's catnip to me. That's exactly the kind of thing I love. And I'm inclined to give a free pass on it if you just give me like the inside dirt, or if you just give me enough of a free pass, like behind the scenes, to watch movies getting made. That doesn't necessarily mean the movie is great, but it means I'm more inclined to be interested because that's just my jam. And Mank barely delivered that. And that's the thing that's frustrating to me. All the things that I really liked about Mank, besides Amanda Seyfried, were the little incidental moments. The actual movie itself ended up feeling overwrought, ham-fisted, self-serving, even though Mankiewicz obviously, it's always made on behalf of Herman Mankiewicz, but not actually, by him. And there's something about it that ultimately is not sticking with me. I saw this a few weeks ago now, and it's starting to slip away. And you have to like, I notice that every year there are movies that I see and maybe even I like, and then 6 months later you tell me like, oh, did you remember that came out this year? I'm like, no, I totally forgot that movie existed, because it has not become part of my internal lexicon. It is not something I reference or think about. And Mank is quickly becoming that, and I can see it becoming that in the future. It's the kind of movie that if it gets a lot of Oscar nominations, we'll probably have to keep talking about for a while, and that will extend its half-life. But I think you're right. I think in the end of the day, even though it's not a total wash, I ended up giving this a negative review on my podcast, critically acclaimed. We gave it we review movies on a scale of C- to C+. I give it a C-. Um, yeah, I think in the end this is going to end up being like not an important movie unless it wins a lot of Oscars, in which case it will be one of those movies that won a lot of Oscars but we don't talk about very much anymore.
Yeah, for me, I feel similarly. I feel like David Fincher gave me a movie that should have been perfect for me, but I think it's trying to evoke a feeling of a classic film that I would not have enjoyed. This is definitely hoping to be a prestige picture, but it's also a movie that's meant to imitate prestige pictures of that time period. I said Yankee Doodle Dandy, The Life of Emile Zola. It's a very specific niche
You don't
film,
like
and
you
if
don't
you
like Yankee
know,
Doodle Dandy?
I've
Oh,
never seen Yankee
that's
Doodle
actually an
Dandy.
exception. I actually think
Actually,
that one's pretty good. But fair enough. There's a lot of really ham-fisted biopics of that era. That's very true.
and I think that's the thing, is that if you know exactly the feeling that I'm bringing up when I bring up those films, you'll know right away whether Mank is for you or not. And I think it's got some good things. Amanda Seyfried is fantastic. I love everything about her. It's a beautiful looking film, even if it's not really necessarily something that you would have found in 1940 looks wise. And it's certainly a film that I hope will inspire people to watch more films of that era. I always say every time one of these throwback features comes out, I always say, like, I'm hopeful that it'll maybe get a new generation into actually watching Citizen Kane, or maybe not watching Citizen Kane, but watching something from that time period. So I mean, I'm hopeful there, but I don't see this sticking in my head. I watch Hail Caesar a lot, and I don't see me watching this ever again.
There's this frustrating thing that Netflix is doing where they've got all of these Orson Welles projects, right? They really pushed that Orson Welles documentary for Best Documentary a couple of years ago.
They finished what is it, The Other Side of the Wind?
I'm getting to that, because here's the thing. They're really pushing Mank hard. They're really pushing the Love Me When I'm Dead. And what they didn't push was The Other Side of the Wind, the actual Orson Welles movie that they finished, which is really good. It's actually a really good film. It's at least an interesting film. And they're saying like, oh, well, yeah, we'll push this documentary and we'll push Mank. But you could have gotten Orson Welles an Academy Award nomination for Best Director like 30 years after he died, and you didn't even try. So I worry about that, because I remember when The Other Side of the Wind came out, they put some more Orson Welles films on Netflix. Not a lot of the big ones. They did have Citizen Kane, but they put like the Stranger on there, and I think maybe The Lady from Shanghai, a couple other good movies. But I question their commitment to using this to actually educate in film history. It feels like they're only using it where they can get clout. Yeah, we get clout for finishing The Other Side of the Wind, but we think we can only get an Oscar for a documentary about The Other Side of the Wind or another fictional film about the making of Citizen Kane. It's weird to me. I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah, this is certainly a movie that if you are interested in the content, you're going to have to look outside of Netflix for it. Your Criterion collections or your anything else. You're not going to find it on Netflix because Netflix has pretty much openly said that they don't really care about classics. But yeah, I mean, it's a perfectly serviceable film. And I think a couple, even some of the bad movies we've done, I think might be more worth your time. Shout out to Liz and Dick. Like I think I had more fun watching Liz and Dick and talking about it than necessarily watching and talking about Mank. So go figure that one.
Liz and Dick had a tawdriness that it was not apologetic for.
Yes.
And here again, it's so serious. It's so serious about everything. Even the jokes are serious. And there's something about it that it just rubs me the wrong way. It feels inhuman. I don't know.
But yeah, let us know your thoughts on Mank. You can email them to us at ticklishbiz@gmail.com, and maybe we'll read them on the next episode. But that's going to close us out for this installment of Based on a True podcast. You can find me on Twitter at journeys_film. And please, if you are obviously listening to this, make sure you've listened to our big episode 100 on Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which is available now for you to listen to. And we will be hard at work through our seasonal hiatus to do more Patreon stuff. Bibbs, where are you online? Where can fans listen to your work? What do you have coming up?
Well, it's 2020, so I'm not like I'm not writing as much as I used to, which is a tragedy. But you can still hear me on a lot of different podcasts. We have the Critically Acclaimed Network, which is a whole network of podcasts produced and hosted by myself and Whitney Seibold. We do weekly movie reviews on Critically Acclaimed. We review TV shows that lasted one season or less on Canceled Too Soon. We have a write-in podcast where we answer letters from our listeners called We've Got Mail. We've got a podcast where we analyze the prehistory of pop culture phenomenon movies. We dedicated 20 episodes to the movies that inspired Star Wars, and now we're dedicating probably about the same number of episodes to the movies that inspired the Rocky Horror Picture Show. We also have a Patreon, patreon.com/critically acclaimed network, where we have more exclusive shows, including a podcast where we review every single Star Trek ever, a podcast when we review every single 1960s Batman episode ever, a podcast dedicated to Oscar nominees, every Best Picture Oscar nominee ever, a podcast dedicated to films that are not on Disney Plus but theoretically should be. We also do downloadable commentary tracks and a bunch of other stuff there. I am also on Twitter at William Bibbiani, and I'm probably forgetting something.
Every time I feel like I'm doing too much, or I should start something else, Bibbs puts out his resume of all the stuff he's doing, like, just on Patreon, and I feel like, nope, I'm never gonna touch that. I'm never gonna be as productive as you are, Bibbs. I don't know how you do it.
I feel like a slacker. That's the thing. Like I was telling you before, like we have this gig economy where like we're trained when we're young to like think that if we're not constantly producing that we're not doing enough. I feel like I'm doing nothing right now. I really do.
Well, if my word means anything, I think you're doing a ton. And I thank you for doing this episode. And for every time we do these, it's a lot of fun. But hopefully we will be back on a more consistent basis. We got a schedule for 2021. And we will be back next time with another Based on a True podcast. Till then.